Okay, I think we're ready to start. Hello, everyone. Peter Maravellis here, welcoming you to another installment of City Lights Live, the virtual expression of the City Lights events calendar. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples. Would like to take this moment at the outset to acknowledge and offer our respect to those who came before us as stewards of the land here in Northern California. Tonight, we are delighted and honored to have with us Aaron Robertson celebrating the publication of his recently published book, The Black Utopians, Searching for Paradise and the Promised Land in America. It's published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. The Washington Post and LitHub have called it one of the most anticipated books of 2024. It has a New York Times Editor's Choice status, as well as being dubbed one of Time's 100 must-read books of 2024. The book arrives to us in a very timely manner, considering our current political climate. Mr. Robertson reflects upon the diverse array of Black utopian visions from the Reconstruction era through to the countercultural period of the late 20th century, through to the present day. He brings to light the ways in which Black Americans have made exceptional efforts to remake the conditions of their lives. The Black Utopians offers a nuanced portrait of the struggle to generate spaces, both of an ideological and physical nature, where a sense of personal and collective agency, dignity, security, and sustenance are manifest in day-to-day life. The Black Utopians is the story of a movement that to this day aims to generate equitable, just, and more radical alternatives for future living. At a time when our political landscape resembles a dystopian novel, we need thinkers like Aaron Robertson to help illuminate the way and offer alternative visions for a more positive future. Aaron Robertson is a writer, editor, and translator of Italian literature. His translation of Giabo Secco's Beyond Babylon was shortlisted for the 2020 PEN Translation Prize and the National Translation Award. In 2021, he received a National Endowment for the Arts grant. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, Foreign Policy, N+1, LitHub, amongst others. He makes his home in Brooklyn, New York. And joining him tonight in conversation is Hafizah Augustus Giroux. We have had the great pleasure of hosting her in the past. She is a writer, poet, and literary agent. She is the author of the poetry collection Un-American and the acclaimed memoir, The Black Period, on personhood, race, and origin. Her writing has appeared in The New Yorker, Bomb, The Believer, The Paris Review, amongst others. She is a Breadloaf Catherine Bakeless Nonfiction Fellow, a Kavi Khanum Poetry Fellow, and a 92Y Women in Power Fellow. So join us now in offering a warm welcome to Aaron Robertson and Hafizah Augustus Giroux. It is such an honor to have you both with us tonight. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you so much, Peter. This is so exciting to be here. So happy.
Thanks so much, Peter, and thank you everyone who is joining us. I think first to start with, for those of you who have not got a chance to read the book yet, I've asked Aaron to start with a reading because the language of this book is just too beautiful, not for everyone to not experience. And so Aaron's going to kick us off with the reading.
Okay, so I will read a short part from the very beginning of the book. And then right after that, Hafizah is going to play a letter from my father. He is a big part of the book. And so here we go. As a boy in church, I often sat beside my mother's parents. My grandfather was an organist and deacon. My grandmother was a choir singer and interpreter for the deaf. They were perfect models of restraint, and they taught me the fundamentals of worship. During service, I did not need to stand up to prove my love for the Most High, raise my hands, or lift my voice, so I didn't. My loyalty to God remained muted. On Sunday mornings, in song-filled sanctuaries, I began to harden myself against the music, hymns whose names I don't remember now. The spirit of my grandparents' religion has faded in me, and I am left to tell a handful of stories about doubt, lasting hope, and Black people's attempts to find new frameworks for our lives after old ones have crumbled. Again and again, I have fantasized about starting my life over. I have wanted to take on the qualities of people who seem sure of their convictions. This includes my father. We are like in some ways, both pained by our distance from Promised Land, our ancestral home in Middle Tennessee. For decades after emancipation, this village was a safe harbor for Black families. Many of the descendants moved north. My father and I never lived in Promised Land. We came from Detroit, but we both held it sacred. The site of this former freedom colony feels like a memorial now. In my own family, migrations never seem to stop. There have always been movements toward and away from one another. My father, once incarcerated, has been trying to restore the sense of cohesion that defined our extended family during both of our childhoods. He wants to mend what I have mostly chosen to mourn, fraying connections with the land, religion, and people who made us who we are. Why did some of us take an optimistic stance toward the future, while others, shaped by similar forces, chose to reject it? When I began to write this book, I asked my father for a favor, to replace the letters he wrote me from prison. I had lost them. Would he send me new ones? Would he tell me who he could have been if he could start his life again, and who he was now that he couldn't? The utopian imagines a bridge that spans the gap between lives. These lives may be easily differentiated, my father's, my own, or found within oneself across time. The people we thought we might have been and the people we became. Here, in the mirror of my father's life and the lives of many others that in some ways resembled mine, I sought variations on a theme. Who were the dreamers who always wanted more than they had? How did the disillusioned, the betrayed, the confined, the forgotten, and the persecuted not merely hold on to life, but expand its possibilities and preserve its beauty? What does utopia look like in Black?
Letter 1. Love, go. I love you, son. I can probably spend 2 hours per day writing about my experiences in life, and I hope that my words are a valuable contribution to your book. We are in a time of tragedy in the world. I don't know how you are framing your story, but the world seems to be heading toward obvious tyranny of government. No matter what happens, I want you to know that you were born from God. God in heaven is the only one who could have created you. Over the past 2 years, I have studied virtually under a pastor by the name of Stephen Darby of Destined Ministries on YouTube. He is a follower of Christ who has studied, prayed, battled wickedness in the spirit realm, and who is by all accounts full of the Holy Spirit. You may find some value by learning about him and looking at 2 or more of his messages on Negro land and messages such as, "Who are we?" This pastor spoke about how only before the time of the coming of Christ, during tribulation, would a lost people find out who they are. The Confederate Church used to have celebrations of the lynching of dark people, yet they called themselves Christian.
Ugh, these letters from your father. I mean, I'm just like, just make me want to weep. But I think what is so beautiful about them is that it's almost just like watching like 2 Baldwins speaking across generations, because you can see where you get, like, your father is a writer. He is, there's so much lyricalness and beauty in his letters. So I just want to start with saying that. But before we, and I got a couple of questions about Dear Old Dad, but before we get into that, so this is, I think that, like, for people who are just joining us, like, this is a book you definitely have to buy. I think that this is definitely like my favorite book of 2024, and one of my favorite nonfiction books I've ever read. It's so amazing. It's so complex. The book is memoir. It's history. It's reportage, oral history. It's a letter from father to son, and in many ways, it's an offering of a son to the histories that made him. Right. And so I'm curious, when you started this project, what was it that you intended to make? And how and where did that shift along the process? Because there's so much research that went into this.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Hafizah. This is so amazing to talk to you because I admire your work, like as you well know. So this just is it's kind of a dream for me. This is a book about sort of Black social visionaries across time. It spans the 19th century, the 20th century, and brings us into the 21st. And initially I think I was avoiding writing about myself and kind of my connection to the idea of utopia because I was just very uncomfortable writing a memoir. I thought the lives of other people were so much more interesting than my own. And in a way, it started with my kind of fascination with this Black nationalist countercultural church in Detroit, where I'm from. This was a church called the Shrine of the Black Madonna, and it was established in the 50s, but it really became prominent in the late 1960s. Its pastor was a man named Albert Cleage Jr. And he was known as this sort of controversial, rabble rouser, this really prominent activist at the time. He was best known for essentially being the great practitioner of what is called like Black liberation theology, which at heart is this idea that Christianity is a really sympathizes with those who have been dispossessed and disinherited. The emphasis was not on this kind of abstract afterlife, but really about the kind of material conditions of Black people's lives. Instead of yearning for a paradise from the great beyond, what are the steps that we can take to create a more bearable life here on earth? I grew up in the Black church, but a very different church than the Shrine of the Black Madonna. I was not from a Black nationalist family. And so in part, the more I learned about this church, the more I learned about all of its experiments throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s, the more I kind of found myself longing for, I think, a little bit of what the church, represented. Um, there was this sense of community cohesion and togetherness that I think defined their kind of communal approach to life. And that was something that was a kind of feeling that I think I had when I was younger. But as I got older, I began to kind of lose that. I began to fall away from that sense of community. So writing the book was an attempt to understand what did it mean for me now to find and create a new sense of community.
I mean, yeah, that's so interesting because just even from when you're talking, I was thinking about like, especially for the people like, some of like the oldest utopias that you're talking about and the oldest people that are in this book, that especially the ones that were either, like they were born into slavery or shortly after, to think about utopia as a like direct resistance to captivity, to the idea that like that anything like beyond captivity could be ours in this life, and then how it intersects with like the Black church that you talk about, like this resistance, like that resistance to like the slave Bible, that thin Bible that we got,
Yeah, that's right.
yeah. Okay, so now I guess like tell us about your father's relationship to utopia, because it seems like it's an idea that fundamental to his upbringing, like it's a literal place for him, and then it found a new life in his imagination due to his like 10 years incarcerated, and it seems to be something that informed his life's and relationship? Because it's very clear to me in this book that one of his utopias is you.
Yeah, I mean, I think for both my dad and myself, despite like all of our kind of ideological differences, we both grew up with a strong sense of connection to our families, but also to the small town that my grandfather was from. So my paternal grandfather was born in this small town called Promised Land, which is west of Nashville. And Promised Land was one of many, all black, like all black towns, or, some people call them freedom colonies that were established, like in the years after the Civil War. This was very much a kind of Reconstruction era town where Black people were attempting for the first time, in many cases, to create their own communities, to build their own institutions. My dad and I, at different points in time, grew up going to Promised Land. This was often, I think, for both of us, a retreat, from the North, like from Detroit, which I think for both of us, there was a loneliness that I think we both felt in Detroit that was kind of, mitigated, like when we went down south and when we were, among our family. Um, I wanted to write about my dad and my relationship with him because I think, the story of Utopia begins like very personally. It starts with someone who is looking at a different life or a different way of living that they kind of long for. And because my dad was incarcerated for 10 years when I was a kid, I think he developed this really understandable fixation on what his life could have been, like had he not gone to prison, what were the communities that he could have been a part of? What were the relationships that he could have had, not only with me, but with other family members? I think before I wanted to write about these broad utopian experiments about how to like transform the foundations of society and the way we think, I really wanted to write about what it felt like to want to transform your own life radically. And that, I think, is what that back and forth between my father, like what I hope it accomplishes.
Oh yeah, it accomplishes. I need to say your cat scared the hell out of me because it's
Oh,
on that box back there and they just arched up and I'm just like, I thought a ghost was rising.
no, it's my cat right there.
Whew. I mean, so do you remember like the first time like you understood or came across the idea of utopia? Because I feel like for
Yeah,
white people they learn about it in school and books, right? But like to
yeah,
your point, like I grew up in like, like Akron, Ohio, and like it just like everyone like kind of like like they weren't like black nationalists, but like we celebrated Kwanzaa. All the African adults black adults I knew had given themselves African names, right? They were all about just like, make it and just keep the money in the community. And so, I think that like just it was only in reading your book that I just struck me like that was an attempt at utopia. And so
yeah,
what was your first like understanding of it? Like did you understand
yeah.
Promised Land in just like retrospect as it?
Uh, in retrospect, yes. Like, I think the first time I learned about, Thomas More and his notion of utopia was probably in high school. I read a play called A Man for All Seasons, which is about Thomas More. And, I think I went down the rabbit hole of learning about his work. Um, but I think my relationship to the idea of utopia, it really began from a very emotional place. It was my connection to Promised Land. I, although I was always a part of the church, growing up, I was very aware of the contradictions that existed within, institutional Christianity, in part because for a while when I was younger, my mother was married to a man, a Christian deacon actually, who was very abusive towards me. And if this was a man of God, then I didn't really want anything to do with that vision of Christianity. Um, I think from a young age, I really began to question a lot of the precepts of Christianity. It felt hard for me to grasp onto.
Yeah.
Promised Land was, I mean, it was a small town in the South. There was a schoolhouse and a church, and it was the site of constant gatherings of people reaffirming one another's dignity, loving one another, cooking for one another, right? Like just I think presence alone was something that I felt so strongly. So that was my utopia. But I think like as I got older, and as I started to learn about the kind of complicated history of utopia, um, when I looked to Tennessee to learn a little bit more about it, I was learning about all, these kind of predominantly or exclusively white utopian socialist, communes like that existed in various parts of Tennessee, including one in Dixon County, like which is where Promised Land is. It was called the Ruskin Colony. Nowhere was there a story about Promised Land. No, like nowhere were there stories really, unless you spoke to people, right? About these very small, often hidden or unrecorded all Black towns that dotted, the American landscape. So I was interested in telling like sort of a, a counter narrative, of utopia. What what were these small towns? What were these kinds of communities that were being built, like in the shadow of and in the aftermath of institutional slavery? It's these kinds of communities like had existed before, the Civil War,
Mhm.
but I wanted to focus on those places that began to really flourish once the war was over.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of an incredible thing about this book is that like you're taking us through utopias through these different solidarities and like you're showing us how like Black utopia is as much a local movement as a national as a global one. You take us to Europe, and so I'm curious when looking for utopia, like can you tell the audience like where exactly did this book take you geographically? And how was it that these utopias of like led you back to your childhood one?
Yeah, of course. So, like I said, like most of it, like even though the book is really anchored in both the story of Promised Land, like, and my own family, as well as the shrine of the Black Madonna, um, I also kind of draw attention to various movements like that existed, in the 60s and 70s. So, um, one movement that I write about that began in Detroit actually was the New African independence movement. This was a coalition of people, of like many of whom had been, Garveyites, or they were loyal to the message of someone like Malcolm X, um, who envisioned creating a kind of literal all Black state in the Black Belt of the American South. They had this vision like of a territory called New Africa, and this was one of the this was like a kind of literal interpretation of Black separatism that said, right, like conditions of the country, like as we know it, right, are intolerable. We kind of live under this oppressive legal regime that we would like to completely disassociate from. That was one instance. But the movement that began at the shrine of the Black Madonna, which Albert Cleage called the Black Christian Nationalist movement, that was not really a geographical, separatist movement. The point of that movement, in part, was to create these kind of parallel, Black-led institutions, right? So within education, right, they were interested like in establishing Black educational initiatives, Black, agricultural initiatives. They established communes not only in Detroit, but also in places like Atlanta and Houston. And sort of most famously in the 1990s, the people who were a part of the shrine had attained the resources to buy thousands of acres of land in South Carolina, which they called Beulah land. And the point of that property ideally was to raise crops to then send to, inner cities throughout the country. It didn't really work out that way because it had been a cattle ranch, and so the land was not like really meant for it. But there, I wanted to kind of like write about experiments, not only like in the American South, but also, in the Midwest too, in the North. And one other kind of, narrative that is a big part of the book is the story of this Black nationalist artist named Glanton Dowdell. He was known for painting this very beautiful, famous image of a Black Madonna and child that was in the shrine of the Black Madonna. And, his life would take him to, Sweden. Like he became one of those Black artist expats, who like life in the US was for him no longer really feasible. And so rather than kind of looking locally, and trying to really to make it here, at a certain point he felt that the only option for him was to go abroad. So it was important for me to write about the movements within the US and people who felt that it was important to look at their homes and try to make that livable, and those who said the only option I have is really to go somewhere else because like what I have in front of me is not an option anymore.
Yeah, I mean, there's such a long tradition of Black people leaving, like whether it's Spain, France, that saying that this is like no longer feasible. I feel like one of the things that I just really love about this book is that like I feel like usually when people talk about utopias, it's the question centers around like, is it possible and who's being naive, right? But like, and so and just like even hearing you talk this idea of like the Black separatist movement, I'm just like, well, white people just call it the suburbs, right? Like they do it all the time, and right, and so like this book goes beyond just like what is utopia and into like who is it for, right?
Right,
Who has
right.
the right to a utopia? Because like especially when you're talking about like every like people's attempts, like Black people's attempts to like secure land to get public funding, and like they're thwarted at every turn by the government and by like and just by like vigilante whites who just like that like any idea of utopia is not for you,
Yeah.
right? And so like so I'm curious, like how did the questions like you were exploring in this evolve?
Yeah. I mean, like that's a key point, right? Is that if if we think of utopia as a perfect or ideal condition that is attainable or that has a clear endpoint, I think you're bound to be disappointed. And I was more interested in writing about people who had a very clear sense, actually, that the struggles that they were a part of were actually not going to end. it's kind of it's a strange, it might be a strange vision of utopia, but I think when I was trying to, define what Black utopianism meant, I believe it starts with the awareness that even though you can be driven by these ideals, that you can have these sort of, really grand visions of what is possible in life. At the same time, you understand that these visions are meant to fuel a struggle that's not going to end. And for me as a storyteller, I think that is like that's fascinating. Like,
Yeah.
how do you write about people who know that they're not really going to get exactly what they want, but they are going to, I think, at different points in their lives, maybe get a little closer to it, right? And maybe find um not only real contentment, but they can help other people, right? Like in a really sort of fundamental way. Um, so that was interesting for me to try to write a story that didn't actually have a happy ending per se, but was composed of, various like small happy endings.
Yeah. Yeah,
um,
because it's just like it's also the same, like, we have the benefit of, of being in the position we are now, but like it's the same problem of like how do you write about like writing about enslavement from people who weren't going to be free for another 300 years, right? But who kept the belief up, right? And what was it for? And so you never know how long the arc of history is or the arc of freedom is. And so that I think that like so much of, and especially when you see these utopia moments being born out of like this, like, people who are so close to emancipation, like this
yeah,
idea that like you can't be sure you will
yeah,
get free, right? And so much of that is you have to keep going. um and I want to return to like faith in the church in a little bit, but like I'm also, I mean, like the interviews you did are like amazing, right? And just like the details you pull out of people. And I'm curious, so like I think this like here's a detail about like let's see, about I think like your grandfather. So he and his six siblings lived in a cabin with their mother and stepdaddy, a perpetually suited traveling sanctified evangelist who could pursue a wasp through a church and smash it as he delivered the word. So you're talking about your grandfather's stepfather, right? And so I'm wondering, like, what do you have to, how do you tell me about your interview process? Because I cannot believe some of the details that you're getting that are just like you felt that you are in that time with them, with those people, that you know them.
yeah. Well, that particular detail was thanks actually to a former resident of Promised Land. So someone who grew up, with my grandfather, who wrote a memoir about Promised Land. And like I also spoke to her about it. But one, I think it was fascinating to speak to people who were in their own ways real historians of these kinds of spaces like that they grew up in, right?
Yeah.
Uh so many of these stories exist and are kind of circulating within communities, but maybe they aren't always highlighted, right? Or really like platformed at all. But I think in speaking to especially the members of the Shrine of the Black Madonna, um, these were like mostly, like in the 1960s and 70s, they were young people like in their 20s, sometimes teenagers who were watching the world around them change, right? Like that these were people who were coming of age as the civil rights movement was happening, as the period of Black power was really beginning. Um, and I wanted, first to kind of establish like trust between us, right? Like this was not a community that I grew up in. And so the really the first hurdle is how do you establish trust? A part of it, I think, is because I also like grew up in the Black church and had a shared language with a lot of these people. Like even if the church, you know, they ended up in was so different from what I knew as a kid. Um, but it's remarkable, I think, what people are willing to tell you. Like if you just say, you know, give me sense details of like what of like what this like what your neighborhood was like, right? Like what was your church like? How how big was your household, right? Like how did you what were the, you know, the kind of concrete ways that you felt you were contributing to a larger social movement? And I think because so many of the people I spoke to were so proud of having like been a part of the Black Christian nationalist movement, you know, they were more than happy to walk me through like what it felt like, you know, like what they had seen. Right. Because like also, as you know, right, like people who were part of movement work, I mean, they they tend to be so excited to tell you just how great it was, and it's never going to be that way exactly, right? So you need to know like all of these small details like that. Um, I think as these people grow older, they know that this stuff is going to get lost. I mostly spoke to people who were in their, you know, late 60s, 70s. And so I think they also like had an awareness that this is a key window, right, to actually like you know, share those stories. So that was how the kind of like minute like details of their lives
Yeah.
shared.
I think I also really appreciated how you, because it's one thing to get like you're like you get those details and then you can see there's someone who would just be like, and I'm going to rephrase this, but like you keep true, like I true to just like the amazing way Southern church going Black people describe their lives and each other, and that the way that it's just like it just like you've recreated the room, the space. So do you have your
Mhm.
book in front of you?
I do, yeah.
So go to page 244. It's my page 244 on, I hope the ARC pages are the same.
Okay, I'm here.
So can you read from the bottom of page 244 where it starts the timber, all the way to they were in Tennessee again
Okay,
on the next
and
page.
yeah, and this is a a chapter of the book that is more personal, like so it's memoiristic. The timbre of the young preacher's voice was surprising. He spoke as though plucking each consonant from a garden. I don't remember the content of his message or how long it took him to lead us to the brink. The weary stood, and those who were still started to tremble. Hands lifted in surrender, heads bowed. I realized then that I had made no effort to understand where I was. I didn't even know the name of this church, and now I was trapped. This preacher was going to crack us open. He growled, and most people were on their feet. He told us to ignore our neighbors as we came right before God. We were to shut out the shouts and hollers and survey ourselves. Only you and the Lord knows what needs addressing. I did not expect to catch the same spirit as everyone else because I thought I had recently expelled it. I was flirting with the word agnostic because of situations like the one unfolding in this sanctuary. I was too pliable to claim atheism. I thought of my father as the preacher spoke. All he could do from prison was write. I had been letting his mother, my granny, take the calls from his various prisons in the years before she and Papa left Michigan to return south. They were in Tennessee again.
Thank you. So, like, this isn't a book about religion, but it's like imbued with it. It's like imbued with questions and ideas about faith and Black people and resistance. And like, you know, like me, you were raised by people to whom the church was like integral to every single aspect of their lives, right? And throughout this book is just imbued with like the cadence, just like I could just like I'd almost like hear you enter that proselytizing preacher voice, like that cadence, and I loved it. Just like it's like the black church runs through your sentences, and like you're also like a translator, you translate like work from Italian, and so like there's not really a question in here except like can you speak to just like what informs your use of language and like the attention you were paying to language in this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. But one, it's funny because I think like as I got older and the more distant I grew from institutional Christianity, the more I realized and maybe was able to appreciate just how rare it was to be around like storytellers who were as compelling as Black preachers. And this is something that is always like reinforced for me usually like when I go back home, right, for the holidays, and it's like the only time I go to church in the year is, with my family. And, I'm kind of there, like I'm grumpy. I'm like, why am I here? And then almost always I'll get irritated because the preacher will be telling a story in such a compelling way, like that I feel this kind of emotional tug to it. And I'm like, God damn it, like you managed to like this is how you get people
Yeah,
in.
speaking in
Um,
tongues.
yeah, and so I think in writing that particular scene, like when I'm in the church, I was really trying to tap into what like what is that moment when a kind of a preacher or just a grand storyteller um, can convert you almost, right? Can kind of, switch you over to their side. It is something to do like with the rhythm of their language, with the emotional experiences that the people around you are having. Um, and so, yeah, I think the role of the chorus in general is something that I was very attentive to throughout the book. It really goes between very private, individual experiences and the kind of group experiences. Um, yeah, so that was a part of it.
I yeah, absolutely love it. And I mean, for the record, for people listening, like that, it's more than just that section. You know, what like down from like the sentences to just like the way you use a clause, right? I think that it is just imbued all throughout, and it's just very beautiful way in which it becomes a medic to what you're talking about. And so like I know you've touched a little bit on Gladstone, but I wanted to kind of like turn back to art because like I really like it really struck me on page 85 when you're talking about Gladstone. He says the you say the academics taught him the visual language of European portraiture that he never saw any reason to emulate, and which he would continue to undermine in ways both spectacular and mundane. And like right where I underlined that, I also wrote utopia, right? So like our utopia is an undermining of the system, right? And so that also means it is in reach because because as we're seeing now, it is possible to topple the American democracy or whatever. And so can you just talk more about like, and this book is filled with just like reference to art. It has like pictures in it, and like isn't one of your father's paintings in it? Is right? It's like
No,
the
no. So
is it who's painting?
of my dad, yes, yeah.
Yeah, of your dad. Yeah. Yeah. And so can you just speak to the role that like art plays in Utopia?
Yeah. So most of I think the conversation around like Black utopias now, I think
Mhm.
tends to focus actually on artistic and cultural creations. So we might think of music, right? Like we might think of people like Sun Ra or Janelle Monáe
Yeah.
or Parliament Funkadelic, right? I think in recent years, the importance of the work of Octavia Butler is probably the most like prominent example of um, the way that Black utopian art can really shape the activities of like activists and shape social movements. I explicitly did not want to write a book that was about cultural theory or like the kind of literature and music and visual art that is so foundational to to Black utopianism. But I would have been remiss like if I didn't pay attention to the role of art in Black social movements. And so like that is really what this character of Glanton Dowdell accomplished for me. Glanton, of course, he painted the mural, this Black Madonna mural for the church, but he was not really a part of the church. His kind of association with the shrine lasted briefly, and then he fled, into exile in Sweden. But the Black Madonna mural was so revolutionary for multiple reasons. So imagine this is the spring of 1967 in Detroit, just 3 months before the rebellion in Detroit, like which is one of the most kind of destructive and tumultuous urban uprisings of the 1960s. And at this Black nationalist church, one Sunday, Easter Sunday, this veil comes down to reveal an 18-foot tall, like 9 foot wide mural of a Black virgin holding a Black baby Christ. And one of the things that, like, there was one congregation member who told Reverend Cleage, like, they are about to kill you, because of this image like that you're showing. But what it did for so many people, not only did it imbue a sense of real, dignity, right? But people saw this Black Madonna mural. They saw somebody that they recognize, someone from their own lives. Like this person looked like my grandmother, or looked like my sister, or looked like my aunt. And to know that that someone holy and someone sacred and someone worthy of sacredness could be born of this person, right? That was a beautiful thing. That was a revolutionary thing that allowed so many people who were part of the social movement to find the energy, to find the kind of hope that they could participate, in something greater. I think the reason that kind of religious iconography was so important for this book, for me, for many of the people like in this movement, is that it allowed like Black Americans to redefine what the sacred actually meant. And that that was really directly a function of the art like that these people were engaging with. So that was just a small, I think, taste of what of the really, central role that art played in like sustaining the social movement.
Yeah, and I think that it also speaks to just like Black people, even though it might not have been like always the most sophisticated art, but there's always art in the homes. And my aunt and my grandmother, they went to a church that had a Black Jesus, and so like you could tell what type of church you were in or what kind of Negro you were with by what color Jesus was,
Right.
And so it's just amazing that that these little moments can can essentially spread a god in your image, right? That had never been like contextualized or even dreamed of. That would literally like could have got you killed,
Yeah.
at a certain time. So everyone, I'm going to turn to Q&A in a little bit if you want to just like start dropping questions, but I've got a couple more while we're waiting for questions. Um, I think that I think one of the crucial parts of this book is that in looking at how utopias are sought, we also see how they are vacated they are dismantled and intentionally turned into like dystopias, right? And like whether it's through redlining, housing discrimination, as like just like the just like the removal of Black features through like integration, like racism and like exile for people who feel like they need to leave. So um
Mhm.
like when you started this project, did you go in with a sense of how utopias are built? Or like what did you I'm curious, like what surprised you?
Yeah, I think like when I started I started the book in part knowing about some of the, the difficulties that had led to the decline of a place like Promised Land, right? So this place, like in my own, family, it became a ghost town like back in the 1970s. So I really did I knew Promised Land as a site of, cultural events and gatherings, but the people who had lived there had for the most part like long been gone. They had migrated north or moved to a, bigger city in the south maybe. Um a part of the problem for Black people who have attempted to retain land, is that, I mean, there have been so many problems like with the um like with heirs property, right? And kind of holding on to land that is then removed from your family through these kind of like uh, underhanded, legal mechanisms that make it hard for Black families to actually know like how much land they have.
Yeah, can you just explain the heirs property? Because that even I was just like, wait, what? This is how they do it? Like,
Yeah. So it tends to happen when there are people who die without writing wills, and that has happened for so many, Black families, right? Then sort of heirs to a piece of property become, like fractional owners. So like someone in your family can die, you have land that you then own, technically a small piece of. Um, but that land is so unstable, and there can just be like one person in the family who decides to then, sell the land to, let's say, a developer who comes in, sees this kind of land, wants to build upon it, like makes an offer, and and then that land can be gone like very swiftly, without there being any real kind of, conversation or collaboration like in the family. Or sometimes uh like black black families can own land in the South maybe, but the heirs have moved away, they're in the North or something. And they still have to pay taxes on the land.
yeah.
But if they don't even know like that they own land, then local city governments can just have a kind of, fire sale, and that land is gone. So there are just so many ways, I think, that the sort of physical spaces that Black people own have been taken away from them over time. This is a kind of, situation that worsened over the course of the 20th century. The problem of Black land loss is one of the sort of most obvious threats um, to Black utopian spaces. And so I knew that in writing this book, um, as much as I was interested in how these spaces were conceived of and created, like I was equally interested in how they were taken away, not only by external forces, but also by, internal forces too. Um, it is a very difficult thing for a social movement, for any utopian movement to hold on to its ideals for a very long time. People are like at the end of the day, individuals with conflicting, desires and needs. And so and that was also like what I traced in the book, the ways that even within the Black Christian nationalist movement, like there were rifts that began to form, like in the aftermath of Albert Cleage's death. So yeah, it felt important to be honest about all of the threats that these Black
Yeah.
movements and spaces face.
I mean, because like people think that this is just like an old problem or a problem of people who have land, but we saw this happen with Hurricane Katrina. People who had been in houses that were given to them by like their like by their grandma or something, and they don't have the title. And when that comes, like when like the Katrina came, they just like lost their houses, right? And white people came in and gentrified it. So since we don't have Q&A questions, I'm going to ask two more questions. So like we're living through a very actually we do have a question. So have you got any thoughts about psychedelics and the Black experience? Nick Powers at SUNY writes in the Black Psychedelic Revolution about an emerging arising.
That's a good question. Uh, one part of the reason I was interested in like learning about like Black utopian communities, especially in the countercultural era of the 60s and 70s, is because I was having a hard time thinking of like the Black hippies. Like I didn't know like where they were
Yeah.
really, like in mainstream narratives about that time. Who were the Black hippies? Like who were the
Yeah.
people taking psychedelics? And what's I was I was hoping to, speak to to kind of more of those people, but like you can imagine that the people I mostly spoke to for the book uh tended not to be interested in in the psychedelic experience.
Or
But
sharing because it's definitely them and they're lying to us still.
yes, exactly that. Or it might not have been fit, for the book. But I do think that, the sort of general psychedelic aesthetic has definitely found its way like into a lot of like like black art,
Yeah.
Afrofuturist. Again, I am thinking of someone like Sun Ra. Um, but even like in the work of like Erykah Badu now, right, or
Yeah.
these people who might not identify explicitly as like Afrofuturists, but they are interested in kind of expanding their consciousness in a general way. Um,
And I feel like to be Black and have hope is kind of already a psychedelic experience because you have
yeah,
to believe in a world that you cannot see and then generally there's no evidence for,
yeah,
so you have to be able to see through that. And so like we are living through deeply disruptive times, both like abroad and here in the US, like everything from Trump to Gaza. And so, like, what lessons did you learn about the course of writing regarding how one approaches the idea of utopia from the center of hell?
yeah. It's a great question, one that I am thinking about now. Um, I think it's a hard thing to find a real sense of comfort in it. In the last week or two, I have had some conversations with people who are like, how, what what does utopia mean in this like decidedly like anti-utopian moment? And I think honestly, there are people who would say it's hard to really hold on to hope. It's hard to continually feel like all of your efforts are thwarted, and that a kind of uh political and sort of social situation is deteriorating. Um, I would say though that I think so many of the people that I spoke to and wrote about in order to make their lives more bearable, that they almost had to sort of separate themselves from this idea of like a grant, completely restructuring society sometimes, or focusing on like what was unattainable, and really asking, okay, what do I need to do with like on my block, like in my city, within my family, to begin ameliorating, my situation. And like it's a hard thing, right? To feel so fractured, to feel so atomized, to feel like the only thing that you can really control or have some kind of sway over is what you can see right in front of you. But I do think that for a lot of people, that is that's what made it possible for them to keep working,
Yeah.
to keep living, frankly.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we've got two questions, and this one's from Nancy. Do many of the freedom towns like Promised Land still exist as Black communities now? What happened to those that disappeared?
Yeah, so on Juneteenth this year, actually, there were two congresswomen who passed a resolution to sort of honor and celebrate the legacy of all Black towns in the U.S. Some people have estimated uh, that there were hundreds, or like even up to 1,200 of these all Black towns that existed throughout North America. That number like is a rough guess, because it's kind of impossible to know how many existed, at any one time. I will say that a lot of the Black towns that were founded like in the decades after the, Civil War, a lot don't exist. There are many that do, like in a way. So there's, places like Allensworth in California, or Eatonville, Florida, like, which is where Zora Neale Hurston was
Mm-hmm.
from. Um, these tend to be spaces where the communities have to really struggle um, to in order to survive, to make sure that you know uh, developers don't come in and purchase the land. They often struggle to attain access to clean water, right? These are they tend to be very under-resourced spaces. Um, but the resolution like that was passed, uh, was introduced in order to say, these are places like that are worth not only preserving but investing in, so that there can be like a real sense of redevelopment, right? But and so it's hard to say how many of these towns exist now, but there are some.
And like, would you also say that that in terms of Black towns, like from like their inception, that there must have, while there are, plenty of intentional ones, there must have been even more unintentional ones just due to segregation, right?
Yes, yeah. I mean, so right, the vast majority of the post Civil War Black towns, they were a kind of intentional community, but they were often formed out of absolute necessity. There were no other alternatives really, but
Yeah, where not to get lynched.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. But
Yeah.
for Black people to pool their resources together to to buy property, um, in order to buy this land. Um, I will say though that in 2020, there was this organization called the Foundation for Intentional Community that had established a kind of BIPOC council in order to give technical guidance and assistance to predominantly like Black and Brown led intentional
Mm,
communities that were started either, in 2020 or like shortly, before then. S- so there are small, small
yeah.
pockets throughout the country, where there are, relatively new, like Black utopian,
Utopia's making a
novels.
comeback.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And I think that some of them now are trying to figure out how to create a kind of network, among them, like how to not be so kind of atomized and spread out through the country, but to actually like communicate with each other.
Yeah. Amazing. And so our last question is from Jose Luis. I'm a community organizer, educator, and artist working for Utopia. What
Mm.
lessons, learnings, words of encouragement can you share for developing young leaders to not lose hope along the journey, and for daily folks growing in the hood to find hope, to dare to hope? And then he also added, what story did you learn along the writing of your book that most gave you joy and pride about the Black experience?
Ooh, this is really great. Thank you, Jose Luis. I'll start with the last one and go back. There was one story about the model for the Black Madonna mural. Her name is Rose Walden, and she was born in the South, born in Tennessee, but she moved to Detroit when she was young, and she had a young child in 1967, which is when she was approached to be, the model for the mural. And she had never believed that she was worthy, of being a model. Like she had no idea that that, that someone saw her that way. And when she saw the Black Madonna mural for the first time, um, like what she told me was that the first thing she thought of was the landscape of a farm. Um, she she felt that she understood exactly like what it was that Black people had been struggling for so long. She saw that this artwork was also the same kind of work that a black farmer was doing. Like all of it was to sustain one's with kind of soul and body. And I think my conversation with Rose like was a real highlight throughout this process. And then your last question in terms of you know what to say to young people. I'm young, honestly, right? Like I'm I'm 29 and and I think the thing that actually does make me hopeful um is having conversations and being like very intentional in connecting with people of a very different generation, older people who have been a part of movement work like this. Um, I I wanted to write the book in part because I felt that like I was complaining too much about how the world was, and I was like, okay, I feel like probably the people who are most who have like the most right to complain are those who have done, everything they can to try to make the world better. And so just having conversations uh with people who lived through their own tumult, decades ago, um, that encouraged me because a lot of them still had hope and they weren't, kind of like blind optimists. They were people who knew exactly like what had been lost and like what we are still losing now. Um, but they try to have hope still. And I think I sort of need to believe in that, like even if it's hard.
Yeah, and I think the last thing I'll add to that question, Jose Luis, is that I think for a place for hope is like to Aaron's point, is that like he's young, he's 29, and he's still searching for it. right?
Yeah.
And so, and still making, and like the work of making a record for people to go back to, that the hope is that there's always somebody to pick up the torch. And that's what we're doing. This has been fantastic. Aaron and I could talk forever, but we know, well, it's late for us. But this has been amazing. I think Peter's going to drop the link in to get Aaron's book again. I highly suggest everyone get it. And
Got it.
Thank you, everybody,
thank
for
you, everyone.
watching. And thank you, Hafizah. Amazing.
Of course. Thank you, Peter and City Lights.
Thank you both for gracing our virtual halls. It is such an honor to have you with us. And Aaron, congratulations on a very, very timely and exquisitely produced book. Hafizah, thank you for doing the honors tonight. You are the greatest interlocutor ever. So much respect. Also want to thank all of you for joining us in the audience. And as I mentioned, we have posted the links. Or better yet, if you're in the hood, come on down, pay us a visit, browse our stacks. We're one of the great browsing experiences of all time. We're located in San Francisco's historic North Beach district, woven 7 days a week from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. every day. And tonight's program has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture through our public events, our community outreach, our publishing program, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and critical thinkers. So goodbye, everybody. Please take care. Be kind to each other. Hope to see you all again very, very soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.